Some coincidences don't feel like coincidences at all, and Adrian Wolfe knew that the moment he saw the boy standing across the hallway. It was supposed to be a routine visit, nothing more than a quick appearance at the children's wing of St. Matthew's Medical Center, a quiet donation event his assistant had insisted would be good for public relations. 10 minutes, maybe 15, shake a few hands, smile for a couple of photos, and leave. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Controlled, efficient, predictable, just the way Adrian liked it. But plans had a way of collapsing when something impossible stepped into view, and that's exactly what happened when he turned his head and saw the child, small, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing near the reception desk with a worn backpack hanging off one shoulder. Nothing remarkable about the clothes, just a faded blue hoodie and sneakers that had seen better days. But it wasn't the clothes that made Adrian stop. It wasn't even the way the boy stood quietly while other kids fidgeted and ran around. It was his face. Or more precisely, the shape of it, the sharp line of the jaw that hadn't softened into childhood roundness, the subtle arch of his brows, the way his eyes narrowed slightly as if he were studying the world instead of just looking at it, and for a brief second, something unfamiliar pressed against Adrian's chest, not emotion, not exactly, more like a disruption, a glitch in the logic he relied on to navigate everything, because the reflection he was seeing didn't belong in a random hospital hallway. It belonged in a mirror, his mirror, and Adrian didn't believe in things that couldn't be explained. He didn't believe in coincidence, not when the details aligned too perfectly, not when instinct, that quiet, relentless voice he trusted more than most people, started speaking before reason had a chance to catch up. He should have looked away, should have continued walking. His schedule was tight, his assistant already glancing at her watch, the event coordinator approaching with a bright, rehearsed smile, everything moving forward exactly as it was supposed to, except Adrian didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the boy, who hadn't noticed him yet, or maybe he had, because a second later, the child lifted his head, and their eyes met, and something shifted, subtle but undeniable, the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself but leaves a mark all the same. The boy didn't smile, didn't look confused or intimidated the way most kids did around unfamiliar adults in suits. Instead, he just stared back, calm, almost curious, as if he were trying to place a memory he couldn't fully recall, and that was when Adrian felt it again, stronger this time, not emotion, not attachment, but recognition, raw and unsettling, the kind that doesn't ask permission, it just exists. And for the first time in years, Adrian found himself standing still without a clear reason why, the voices around him fading into background noise, the polished floor, the soft hum of hospital machines, the distant laughter of children, all of it blurring into something insignificant compared to the single, undeniable fact in front of him. That boy looked like him, not vaguely, not in the way people casually compare strangers, but in a way that made his mind start calculating before he even realized it, details lining up, features matching, instinct pushing against logic, and then, just as quickly as the moment formed, it shifted again, because a woman stepped into the frame, her hand gently but firmly wrapping around the boy's shoulder, pulling him a half step back, protective, cautious, and Adrian's eyes moved to her without thinking. And for a fraction of a second, time did something strange. It didn't stop, it didn't slow, it simply folded, bringing something from years ago into the present so abruptly it almost felt physical. Claire Bennett, the name surfaced instantly, not because he had been thinking about her, he hadn't, not in a long time, but because some memories don't fade, they just wait, and there she was, older, thinner, her expression sharper, more guarded, but unmistakably the same woman he had once signed divorce papers with, the same woman who now avoided his gaze as if looking at him would confirm something she wasn't ready to face, and that was when the disruption turned into something else entirely, something colder, more precise, because Adrian didn't react the way most people would. There was no visible shock, no confrontation, no questions thrown into the air. Instead, he simply watched, his mind already moving ahead, connecting fragments, ignoring the noise, focusing on the only variables that mattered, the boy, Claire, and time, always time. Because if there was one thing Adrian Wolfe trusted more than instinct, it was numbers, and numbers didn't lie, not when you knew how to read them. And as Claire guided the boy away, her grip tightening just slightly, as if she could remove him from the equation entirely, Adrian finally looked down at his watch, not because he needed to check the time, but because it gave him something to anchor the calculation that had already begun forming in the back of his mind. Months, years, dates that hadn't mattered before suddenly rearranging themselves into a pattern he couldn't ignore, and without saying a word. Without breaking the composed exterior everyone expected from him, Adrian Wolf made a decision so quietly that no one around him noticed, but it was already in motion, already shaping what would come next, because some answers aren't found by asking questions, they're found by counting, and Adrian had just started counting months. Adrian did not look back as he walked out of the hospital, but the image followed him anyway, precise and persistent, as if it had been etched into his mind with intention rather than chance, and by the time the car door closed behind him and the city noise faded into the insulated silence of leather and tinted glass, the calculation had already begun again, not rushed, not emotional, just steady, deliberate. The way he approached every decision that mattered, his driver asked for the next destination, but Adrian did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular as numbers aligned in quiet sequence, years since the divorce, months that followed, the exact window that had once been irrelevant now narrowing into something far more specific, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost indifferent, redirecting the car back to the office. As if nothing had changed, even though everything had, because Adrian Wolf did not react, he investigated. An investigation required patience, structure, and distance, not confrontation, not yet, never too early, especially not when the variables were still incomplete. The office greeted him with its usual precision, glass walls, muted tones, controlled temperature, every detail curated to eliminate distraction. But distraction was already there, sitting quietly beneath the surface, waiting. And instead of pushing it away, Adrian let it remain, observing it the same way he had observed the boy, without interference, without assumption. His assistant briefed him on meetings, contracts, numbers that would normally demand full attention, but today they were processed faster than usual, decisions made with efficiency that bordered on automatic, because part of his mind was elsewhere, replaying small details, the angle of the boy's head, the way his eyes held steady instead of shifting away, the almost imperceptible resemblance that should not have existed unless something deeper connected them, and Adrian did not believe in surface-level similarities, not when patterns could be broken down into measurable truth. By late afternoon, he had already made the first quiet move, a single call placed without announcement, requesting records, not directly tied to Claire, not yet, but to the hospital itself, timelines, departments, any information that could be accessed without raising suspicion, because subtlety was always the most effective strategy, and while the request was being processed, Adrian leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself to revisit the one detail that mattered more than anything else, the timing, because timing was never random, it followed rules, and those rules could be traced, reconstructed, verified. The date of the divorce surfaced clearly in his mind, not because it held emotional weight, but because it was documented, exact. Followed by a stretch of time he had never bothered to examine closely, days blending into weeks, weeks into months, until now, when those months began to take on new significance, forming a narrow window that aligned too closely with the age of the boy he had just seen, and that was when the quiet certainty began to settle in, not as a conclusion, but as a direction, a path that demanded to be followed, regardless of where it led. Adrian reached for his watch again, not to check the hour, but to ground the calculation, counting backward, reconstructing sequences with the same precision he applied to business acquisitions and risk assessments. Because this was no different, just another unknown variable entering a system he intended to control, and control required clarity, not assumption, not impulse. Across the city, Claire moved faster than usual, her grip on Lucas's hand tighter than it needed to be as she guided him out of the hospital and into the late afternoon light, her breathing uneven despite the calm expression she forced onto her face. She did not look back, not once, as if refusing to confirm what she already feared, but fear had a way of showing itself in small cracks. In the way her voice softened when Lucas asked why they had to leave so quickly, in the way she knelt down to adjust his hoodie even though it did not need adjusting, buying herself a few extra seconds to steady her thoughts, because she had seen him too, Adrian Wolf, exactly as she remembered, and yet somehow more distant, more unreadable, and the worst part was not his presence, it was his silence, because Claire knew that silence, knew what it meant when he chose not to act immediately. It meant he was thinking, calculating, connecting pieces she had spent years trying to keep apart, and as she finally let go of Lucas's hand to open the car door, her fingers trembled just slightly before tightening again, as if holding onto something invisible, something fragile, because if Adrian had started to notice, if he had started to question, then it was only a matter of time before the past she had buried so carefully would begin to surface, and this time, she would not be the one controlling how the story unfolded. Numbers had a way of stripping emotion out of everything, and that was exactly why Adrian trusted them more than memory, more than instinct, because instinct could mislead, but numbers, when arranged correctly, only pointed in one direction, and that direction was becoming harder to ignore with every passing hour. By the time the report from the hospital came in, Adrian had already cleared his schedule for the evening, not publicly, not in a way anyone would question, just small adjustments, quiet rescheduling, the kind that went unnoticed unless someone was looking for it. And no one ever looked for what Adrian chose to hide. The file itself was incomplete, as expected, surface-level data, departments, patient intake averages, nothing directly tied to Claire or the child. But Adrian had not expected answers yet. This was never about finding proof immediately, it was about building a framework, narrowing the field until only one conclusion remained. He placed the folder on his desk and did not open it right away. Instead, he leaned back, eyes half-focused as he replayed the timeline again. This time slower, more precise, starting from the date that had been legally stamped and filed, the divorce finalized, signatures exchanged, a clean break on paper. But paper had never reflected reality perfectly, and Adrian knew that better than anyone, because the end of something rarely happened on the exact day it was recorded. There were always overlaps, delays, moments that stretched beyond official boundaries, and that was where the calculation shifted. He reached for his phone, scrolling not through recent contacts, but archived records, old calendar entries that had not been deleted, meetings, trips, dates that had once held significance but had since been buried under years of progress, and there it was, subtle but undeniable, a period of time after the official separation that did not align as cleanly as he had remembered, a gap that was not really a gap at all, more like a blurred edge where the past had not ended as abruptly as he had assumed. Adrian's expression did not change, but something behind it sharpened, because that detail alone did not prove anything. But it removed a barrier, it opened a possibility that had previously been dismissed without thought, and once a possibility existed, it demanded to be tested, across the city. Claire sat at the small kitchen table of her apartment, the kind of place that felt temporary even after years of living in it, a single overhead light casting a soft glow over scattered papers and a half-empty mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Lucas was in the next room, his voice faint as he talked to himself while playing. Unaware of the tension that had settled into the walls, Claire stared at nothing in particular, her hands resting flat against the table as if grounding herself, but her mind was not still. It was racing through the same fear she had tried to suppress since leaving the hospital, because she knew Adrian, not the version the world saw, not the controlled, distant figure in tailored suits, but the version that observed, calculated, and never stopped until he had answers, and that was what terrified her the most, not confrontation, not anger, but his patience, because patience meant he would not make mistakes. It meant he would find the truth eventually, no matter how carefully she had hidden it. Her gaze shifted toward the doorway where Lucas's shadow moved across the floor, and for a brief moment, her expression softened, but it did not last, because reality pressed back in just as quickly, reminding her that time, the one thing she had relied on to keep the past buried, was no longer on her side. Back in his office, Adrian finally opened the folder, scanning the contents with quiet efficiency, not looking for confirmation, but for patterns, for anything that could connect the hospital to a specific timeline, a specific event. And when he did not find it immediately, he did not stop, he simply adjusted, because this was never about one source of information, it was about layering details until they formed something undeniable. He set the file aside and picked up his pen, not to write notes, but to mark a date on the calendar in front of him, a single point in time that now carried more weight than it ever had before. And as the ink settled onto the page, Adrian Wolfe reached a conclusion that was not yet a fact, but no longer a coincidence either, because the months he had started counting were beginning to align in a way that left very little room for error. And if the pattern continued, then the question was no longer whether the boy could be his, but how long it would take before that possibility became something neither of them could deny. Claire had learned that routine was the only thing that kept her world from falling apart, so the next morning she followed it with quiet precision, waking Lucas before sunrise, preparing a simple breakfast, checking his backpack twice even though she already knew everything was in place, every small action deliberate, controlled, as if structure alone could keep the past from catching up. But beneath that routine, something had shifted, a tension that refused to settle, because no matter how Much she tried to convince herself otherwise, she knew Adrian had seen enough to start asking questions, and Adrian Wolfe did not stop once he started. Across town, Adrian's morning unfolded just as methodically, but for entirely different reasons. His schedule remained intact on the surface: meetings, calls, decisions executed with the same efficiency that defined his reputation, yet underneath that controlled exterior, every moment was being filtered through a single, persistent thread of thought, one that had already begun to reshape his priorities without altering his behavior. By mid-morning, he had redirected a portion of his resources toward something that appeared insignificant to anyone else: a quiet inquiry into local school registrations connected to the hospital district. Nothing invasive, nothing that would raise concern, just enough to narrow possibilities. Because Adrian understood that answers did not come from force, they came from precision, and precision required patience. When Claire arrived at Lucas's school, she lingered longer than usual, her eye scanning the parking lot, the sidewalks, every passing car, searching for something she could not clearly define but feared anyway. Lucas tugged lightly at her hand, asking why she looked worried, and Claire forced a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, kneeling down to adjust his jacket even though the temperature was mild. Using the moment to steady herself before letting him go, she watched him walk toward the entrance, small steps, familiar routine, and for a brief second, everything felt normal again, until she noticed the black sedan parked across the street. It was not out of place, not obviously connected to anything, but something about its stillness, the way it remained exactly where it was while other cars came and went, made her chest tighten slightly. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was imagining patterns where none existed, yet she did not look away until Lucas disappeared inside the building, and even then, the unease stayed with her as she walked back to her own car, unaware that across the street, behind tinted windows, Adrian sat in complete silence, his gaze steady, not on Claire, but on the entrance Lucas had just walked through. Because this was not about confrontation, not yet, this was about confirmation, and confirmation required observation over time, not a single moment, not a single resemblance, but a pattern that could not be dismissed. He had arrived early, before the first bell, noting the rhythm of arrivals, the interactions between parents and children, the subtle details that most people overlooked, and when Lucas appeared, Adrian did not react outwardly, but internally. The same quiet recognition surfaced again, reinforced not by a single feature, but by movement, by the way the boy carried himself, by the small, almost imperceptible gestures that mirrored something Adrian recognized not from memory, but from instinct. And as Claire turned to leave, Adrian's attention shifted to her briefly, noting the tension in her posture, the way her eyes lingered just a second too long on the surroundings, confirming what he had already begun to suspect. She was aware of the risk, which meant she knew there was something to hide, and that alone was enough to push the situation beyond coincidence. Adrian did not step out of the car, did not call out, did not give any indication that he was there. Instead, he simply reached for the file beside him, adding a single note, a time, a location, another piece in a growing structure that was becoming harder to dismantle with each passing hour, because the more he observed, the clearer the pattern became, and patterns, once fully formed, only led in one direction, toward a truth that could no longer be avoided, no matter how carefully it had been concealed. Claire tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that the unease following her since the hospital was nothing more than old fear resurfacing, but fear did not linger this long without reason, and by the third day, even routine began to feel fragile, as if any small change could expose something she had spent years keeping hidden. She adjusted her schedule without realizing it, leaving the apartment earlier, arriving at the school at slightly different times, avoiding the same coffee shop she used to visit every morning. Small changes that seemed insignificant on their own but together formed a pattern of avoidance, and patterns, she knew, could be read by someone who understood how to look. Across town, Adrian had already noticed the shift, not immediately, but gradually, through comparison, through repetition, because observation without variation meant nothing, but variation, even slight, revealed intention. And Claire's movements were beginning to show intention. He did not follow her directly, did not place himself in obvious proximity again. Instead, he expanded the scope, adjusting his approach the same way he would in any complex situation, gathering information from multiple angles, cross-referencing details that alone meant little but together created clarity. School records had been partially accessed through legitimate channels, nothing personal, just enrollment confirmation, age brackets, general data, enough to confirm that Lucas Bennett existed. within the system exactly where Adrian had expected him to be, and that alone tightened the pattern further because the timeline he had constructed continued to align without resistance. Later that afternoon, Claire stood at the checkout counter of a small grocery store, her attention fixed on the total being displayed, but her mind elsewhere, replaying the past few days with increasing clarity, the car she had noticed, the feeling of being watched, the quiet certainty that Adrian would not simply walk away from something that did not make sense. She paid quickly, gathered her bags, and stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, and for a brief moment, everything appeared normal again, until she heard a voice behind her, calm, measured, unmistakable, calling her name in a way that made her entire body still before she even turned around. Adrian did not raise his voice, did not step closer than necessary, but his presence alone shifted the air between them. Controlled, precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding, Claire turned slowly, her expression composed but her eyes betraying the tension she could not fully suppress, and for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to establish that this was not a coincidence, not an accidental encounter, but a moment Adrian had chosen, calculated, and initiated on his own terms. He glanced briefly at the grocery bags in her hands, then back at her, his gaze steady, analytical, as if he were confirming something rather than discovering it. When he finally spoke, his tone was even, almost neutral, but there was a weight behind it that Claire recognized instantly, not accusation, not yet, but direction, as if the conversation had already begun before either of them said a word. He did not ask how she had been, did not reference the years that had passed. Instead, he chose the one detail that mattered most, the one that could not be ignored, and he approached it with the same precision he applied to everything else. He mentioned the hospital, casually, as if it were a passing observation, but his eyes remained fixed on her reaction, measuring it, dissecting it in real time. Claire felt the pressure immediately, not from his words, but from the absence of emotion in them, because Adrian was not guessing, he was testing, and every second she delayed, every subtle shift in her expression, became part of the answer he was building. She responded carefully, keeping her voice steady, offering a simple explanation, nothing elaborate, nothing that could be easily contradicted, but even as she spoke, she knew it was not enough, because Adrian did not interrupt, did not challenge her directly. He simply listened, and that was worse, because listening meant he was collecting, comparing her words against the pattern he had already constructed, and when she finished, the silence returned, heavier this time, stretching just long enough for the truth to settle unspoken between them. Adrian did not smile, did not show frustration. Instead, he gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging something only he fully understood. And then he said one sentence that shifted everything without raising his voice. He mentioned the boy, not directly, not by name, but clearly enough that there was no confusion about who he meant, and in that moment, Claire realized that the situation had already moved beyond denial, because Adrian was no longer searching for a possibility, he was narrowing in on a conclusion, and the way he said it, calm, controlled, almost detached, made one thing painfully clear: he was not going to stop until every missing piece was accounted for, no matter how carefully she had tried to hide them. Claire did not respond immediately after Adrian mentioned the boy, because there was nothing she could say that would not reveal more than she intended, and Adrian noticed that, not as hesitation, but as confirmation, the kind that did not need words to become clear. So he did not press further in that moment, did not demand answers in a public parking lot where every reaction could be constrained by circumstance. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a conversation that would continue later, and stepped back just enough to create space, his voice calm as he ended the exchange with a simple statement that carried more weight than any direct question, telling her that avoidance would not change the outcome. And then he walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Claire standing there with the realization that the situation had already shifted beyond her control. That night, Adrian did not return to his office after his final meeting. Instead, he went somewhere he had not needed to visit in years, a private records facility his company maintained for legal archives, the kind of place where information was stored long after it had lost relevance to everyone except those who knew exactly what they were looking for. He requested access without explanation, and within minutes, files were brought out, not related to his business, but to his personal history, the finalized divorce documents, timelines, dates that had once marked the end of something but now served a different purpose entirely. He reviewed them with the same precision he applied to financial reports, scanning for inconsistencies, for details that had been overlooked at the time but now held significance, and as he compared those records to the calendar entries he had already uncovered, a pattern began to solidify, not perfect, not complete, but consistent enough to eliminate coincidence. The separation had not been as clean as it appeared on paper, there had been overlap, time that had not been accounted for with the clarity he had assumed. And that realization alone shifted the entire equation, because it meant the timeline he was constructing no longer relied on speculation, it had a foundation. Across town, Claire sat on the edge of Lucas's bed, watching him sleep, his small frame barely moving under the blanket, his breathing steady, peaceful in a way that felt almost fragile, and for a moment, she allowed herself to focus only on that, on the quiet simplicity of a child who had no idea how close his world was to changing. But the moment did not last, because reality pressed in again. Adrian's voice, his calm certainty, the way he had not needed to ask direct questions to make it clear that he already knew enough, and Claire understood something then that she had been trying to deny. This was not a situation she could manage by staying silent, because Adrian did not rely on what people told him, he relied on what he could prove, and proof was something she could not control forever. The next morning, Adrian's investigation moved forward with a level of precision that left no room for error. He did not approach Claire again, did not attempt another conversation. Instead, he expanded his search, directing his resources toward medical records, not directly requesting anything that would violate privacy, but tracing pathways, identifying doctors, departments, timeframes that aligned with the period he had isolated. And while most of the information remained out of reach, one detail stood out: a discrepancy in record availability, a gap where documentation should have existed but did not, and Adrian recognized that immediately for what it was: not absence, but removal, because records did not simply disappear without intention. An intention implied involvement, someone had made a decision to obscure part of the past, and that decision had likely been made with a specific purpose, to protect something, or someone. Adrian leaned back in his chair, the pieces now forming a structure that no longer felt uncertain: the boy, the timeline, Claire's reaction, the missing records, each element reinforcing the others, narrowing the possibilities until only one remained that could explain all of it at once. And for the first time since this began, Adrian allowed himself to acknowledge the conclusion that had been building quietly beneath every calculation, not as a question, but as a near certainty, because if the pattern held, if every detail continued to align the way it had so far, then what he had seen at the hospital was not coincidence, not resemblance, but something far more significant, something that had been kept from him for years. And as that realization settled into place, Adrian did not react with anger or disbelief. Instead, his expression remained calm, controlled, because the only thing that mattered now was what came next, and what came next would not be determined by chance, but by the choices he was about to make. Adrian did not rush the next step, because rushing would imply uncertainty, and he was no longer uncertain, not in the way he had been at the beginning. What remained now was confirmation through exposure, and exposure required proximity, not from a distance, not through files and records, but through direct interaction, controlled, intentional, and impossible to misinterpret. That afternoon he adjusted his schedule once again, cancelling a meeting that could easily be moved and replacing it with something far more important, something no one else in his organization would understand the significance of. He arrived at the school earlier than usual, not hidden this time, not behind tinted glass or across the street, but standing openly near the entrance where parents gathered, his presence subtle but unmistakable, a man in a tailored suit among casual conversations and restless children. And while a few people glanced at him with mild curiosity, no one questioned why he was there, because confidence had a way of eliminating suspicion. Across the courtyard, Lucas stepped out of the building with the same quiet composure Adrian had noticed before, his backpack slightly uneven on his shoulders, his gaze scanning the crowd without urgency. And for a brief second, before Claire appeared, the boy's eyes met Adrian's again, and this time there was no distance, no barrier, just a clear line of sight that held longer than coincidence would allow. Adrian did not move, did not signal, but something in that stillness seemed to draw the boy closer, not physically, but in attention, as if recognition existed without explanation. And then Claire emerged, her pace quick, her expression tightening the moment she saw Adrian standing there in full view, no longer observing from a distance, but placing himself directly into her world, into Lucas's world. And that was when the tension shifted from controlled uncertainty to something far more immediate. Claire reached Lucas first, her hand instinctively resting on his shoulder, not forceful, but protective, as if anchoring him in place, her eyes locking onto Adrian with a mixture of restraint and urgency, because this was the moment she had been trying to avoid, the moment where silence would no longer be enough. Adrian took a step forward, measured, deliberate, closing just enough distance to make conversation inevitable, his gaze lowering briefly to Lucas before returning to Claire, not ignoring the boy, but acknowledging him in a way that made the connection impossible to dismiss. When he spoke, his voice remained calm, even, but there was no ambiguity left in his tone, no space for misinterpretation. He addressed Claire first, not with accusation, but with clarity. Referencing the timeline without stating it directly, the hospital, the records, the details that had begun to align in ways that could no longer be ignored, and Claire felt the pressure immediately, not from volume or aggression, but from precision, because Adrian was no longer asking questions. He was presenting a structure that was already built, waiting only for the final piece to be confirmed. Lucas looked between them, his expression shifting from curiosity to something quieter, more focused, as if he sensed the weight of the moment even without understanding it fully. And then something unexpected happened, something neither of them had planned for. Lucas stepped slightly forward, just enough to close the space between himself and Adrian, his small hand adjusting the strap of his backpack in a gesture so familiar, so instinctively similar, that Adrian felt the recognition settle deeper than before, not as suspicion, but as something closer to certainty. The boy tilted his head slightly, studying Adrian with the same calm intensity, and then, without hesitation, he spoke a single word, soft but clear, not directed by instruction, not prompted by anyone, but natural, unfiltered, and it landed with more force than any evidence Adrian had gathered so far, because it was not a question, not a guess, but something closer to instinct. And in that moment, the distance between possibility and truth narrowed to almost nothing. Claire's breath caught, her grip on Lucas tightening just slightly, as if trying to pull him back from something that had already moved beyond her control. But Adrian did not react outwardly, he did not reach out, did not interrupt. He simply stood there, absorbing the moment with a level of stillness that made it clear he understood exactly what had just happened, because some confirmations did not come from documents or timelines, they came from something far more immediate, something that could not be calculated or erased. And as Lucas remained there, looking up at him without fear, without hesitation, Adrian Wolfe realized that the answer he had been constructing piece by piece had just revealed itself in a way that left no room for denial, only for what he would choose to do next. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, soft and simple yet heavy enough to shift everything that came before it, and Claire felt it instantly, the way one unguarded moment could unravel years of careful silence, her hand tightening around Lucas's shoulder as if she could pull him back into a reality where that word had never been spoken. But it was too late for that, because Adrian had already heard it, and more importantly, he had already understood it, not as a child's random guess, not as coincidence, but as something far more precise, something that aligned too perfectly with every calculation he had made. And yet, despite the weight of that moment, Adrian did not react the way Claire had feared. There was no visible shock, no anger, no immediate demand for answers. Instead, his expression remained composed, almost unnervingly calm, as if he had been expecting this confirmation all along. And in a way, he had, because the evidence had been building long before this moment. This was simply the point where it could no longer be denied. Claire exhaled slowly, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the strain she had been carrying, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady but quieter than before, not defensive, not confrontational, but something closer to resignation, because she understood that silence was no longer a shield, it was just a delay. And delays only worked until someone like Adrian decided they no longer mattered. She asked Lucas to go wait by the gate, her tone gentle but firm, and for a moment, the boy hesitated, glancing between them as if sensing the shift, but eventually he nodded and stepped away, leaving just enough distance for the conversation that had been postponed for years to finally begin. Adrian did not interrupt, did not question the decision, he simply waited, his attention focused entirely on Claire now, not with impatience, but with a level of stillness that made it clear he was ready to hear the truth without needing to force it. And that was what made it harder, because Claire had prepared herself for confrontation, for anger, for accusation she could push back against, but not for this, not for the quiet certainty in his gaze that suggested he already knew enough, that whatever she said now would not change the conclusion, only explain the path that led to it. She took a breath, steadying herself before speaking again. and when she did, the words came carefully at first, measured, controlled, but beneath them was something deeper, something she could no longer keep hidden. She told him that she had found out after the divorce, not immediately, not in a way that gave her time to reconsider anything, but suddenly, unexpectedly, at a point when everything between them had already been legally and emotionally closed, and in that moment, her world had shifted in a way she had not been prepared for. Adrian listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharpening with every detail, because this was the missing piece. The explanation that connected the timeline he had built with the reality he was now facing. Claire continued, explaining that she had tried to reach him at first, not directly, not in a way that would reopen everything, but enough to consider the possibility, and what she found instead was distance, not intentional cruelty, but a separation that had already been finalized in every way that mattered, and faced with that, she made a decision, not out of spite, not to keep something from him, but because she believed it was the only way to move forward without dragging both of them back into something that had already ended. Her voice faltered slightly at that point, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what that decision had cost her over the years, and Adrian absorbed it all in silence, not reacting, not interrupting, because he was not evaluating her emotions, he was aligning her explanation with the structure he had already built, and everything she said fit, not perfectly, but enough to confirm what he had already concluded, that this was not deception. In the way he had first considered, it was a choice made under circumstances he had not fully accounted for, and as Claire finished, the silence returned once more, but this time it was different, not filled with uncertainty, but with the quiet recognition that the truth was now fully present between them, no longer hidden, no longer incomplete, and as Adrian finally shifted his gaze briefly toward Lucas in the distance, one thing became clear: this was no longer about discovering what had happened, it was about deciding what would happen next, and that decision, like everything else Adrian Wolfe did, would not be made lightly. Adrian did not respond immediately after Claire finished speaking, not because he needed time to understand what she had said, but because he was deciding what to do with it, his silence stretching just long enough to make it clear that this moment carried weight beyond anything that had come before, and when he finally moved, it was not toward Claire, but toward Lucas, each step measured, deliberate, as if he had already committed to a direction that did not require hesitation. Claire watched him with a mixture of tension and inevitability, knowing that whatever happened next would not be something she could control, because Adrian was no longer operating on uncertainty, he was acting on conclusion. Lucas looked up as Adrian approached, his expression calm, curious rather than afraid, as if the connection between them did not need to be explained for it to exist, and for the first time, Adrian allowed his attention to settle fully on the boy without restraint, not as an observation, not as a variable in a calculation, but as something real, something present, something that belonged to him in a way that no document or timeline could define. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the details clearly, the small features that had once seemed like coincidence now aligning with a certainty that required no further proof, and yet, even in that moment, Adrian did not reach out, did not close the distance entirely, because control was not something he abandoned, not even now. He spoke instead, his voice steady, direct, asking Lucas a simple question that carried no pressure, no expectation, just clarity, and Lucas answered without hesitation, his response natural, unfiltered, the kind of answer that could not be coached or constructed, and in that exchange, something shifted again, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in a way that made the situation impossible to return to what it had been before. Adrian straightened slightly, his gaze moving briefly back to Claire, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a level of finality that made it clear the conversation they had just had was no longer open for interpretation. The past had been explained, the present had been confirmed, and now only one thing remained: what would happen next? Claire felt it immediately, the shift from uncertainty to decision, and for a brief moment, she braced herself for resistance, for a demand that would disrupt everything she had built over the years. But Adrian did not raise his voice, did not issue commands. Instead, he spoke with the same calm authority that defined every aspect of his life, stating his intention without needing to justify it. He made it clear that Lucas was not something he would ignore, not now, not after everything had aligned the way it had, but at the same time, he did not attempt to take control in the way Claire had feared. He did not threaten, did not challenge her role. Instead, he established something far more difficult to oppose: involvement, steady, consistent, unavoidable, because absence was no longer an option. Claire listened, her attention shifting into something more complex. Because what he was offering was not a disruption in the way she had imagined, it was a change that would unfold. Gradually, methodically, just like everything else Adrian did, and that made it harder to resist, because it did not come with conflict, it came with certainty. Lucas looked between them again, sensing the change even if he could not fully understand it, and for a moment, the three of them stood there in a quiet space that felt suspended between what had been and what was about to begin, and as Adrian finally turned to leave, not abruptly, not as an ending, but as the first step in something that would continue, he paused just long enough to glance back once more, his expression unchanged, but his presence no longer distant, because the distance that had existed for years had already been closed in. A matter of days, and this time, it would not reopen, because Adrian Wolf did not walk away from something once he had decided it belonged within his world, and as Claire watched him disappear into the distance, she understood that the story she had spent years controlling was no longer hers alone. It had shifted into something larger, something that would unfold whether she was ready or not, and somewhere in that realization, between fear and inevitability, there was also something she had not expected, a quiet question that had not yet been answered, not about the past, but about what this new reality would become, and whether the choices made from this point forward would lead to something that neither of them had planned but both would have to face together.